In the first section of my DVD on Anatoly Karpov, we'll be seeing some games from the earliest part of his career, where he, beginning from when he started playing chess until the point where he was challenging for the World Championship, so until about 1973. Here we'll see, in this video, we'll see one of his earliest games, played only at the age of 11 in the town of Zlatoust in 1962. I believe Zlatoust is where Karpov was from. So his opponent in this game was Piskunov, a player named Piskunov. I'm not sure who this was, but in any case, we can see in this game, even at such an early age, Karpov's very methodical play, extremely sound and well thought out strategic play, even at such a young age. So Karpov began with the move e4, knight f6. Piskunov chose Alekhine's defense. e5, knight to d5, c4, knight b6, d4, d6, and now e takes d6. So Karpov takes the most sound approach to combating the Alekhine's defense. Instead of the ambitious and wild moves like f4 or even the main line with knight f3 on the previous move, he goes for the exchange variation where white seeks just to have a safe small advantage and a space advantage without taking on too many risks. Black took back with the e-pawn now. I believe at the time c takes d6 was more common. Now e takes d6, as Piskunov played, is more common, but earlier on, as I remember, this unbalancing move was more often played in this position. But later, it became clear that white has this good setup with knight c3, bishop e3, b3, and rook c1, removing the pieces from the long diagonal and preparing to meet black's break in the center with e5. And black has some difficulties there. It's still played, of course, but this has caused more players to take back with the e-pawn, as was played in this game. Here it's a symmetrical kind of position, in the pawn structure at least, with no one having any majorities, where white has a small space advantage, and black hopes to hit back and close the game sometimes by d5, and then target the d4 pawn in the future, whereas white hopes to restrict black and slowly squeeze his position with a space advantage. Karpov now played knight c3, knight c6, and now a3. Now this move is not typical and has only been played a couple of times, and you can definitely say it's not the most relevant move in this position, but of course you can get away with a lot, and it can be viewed as a sort of a waiting move. You can imagine from a player only 11 years old, you can get these occasional random moves like a3. I don't know what kind of thinking caused this move, but it's at least not terrible. And it can be useful in the future when black plays d5 later. Sometimes white plays c5 and then follows it up by b4, and then the move becomes relevant. But at this point, it's fairly unclear how important it'll be to play a3. It can also be useful in terms of stopping knight to b4. Sometimes bishop d3 can be met by knight to b4 in the future. Black now played bishop f5. Most likely this was the thinking of the players. Well, I mean, it's certainly possible to play bishop d3 if black hadn't played knight c6, bishop e7, bishop d3, most likely black wants to stop, is afraid of the setup with bishop d3, and so that's why he played bishop f5 to prepare to challenge the bishop. But typical setup with bishop e7 would be absolutely fine here, and then castles, and maybe bishop f5, maybe bishop g4 if white develops the knight early on. But black chose bishop f5, bishop e3, and now g6, which to my mind this move is inconsistent with bishop f5. These moves don't look like they work together so well, and it would be more natural to just play bishop e7 here. rather than weakening the position and blocking the retreat of the light squared bishop, which could be sometimes important. But Piskunov chose g6, bishop d3, queen to d7, so black hopes to hold the f5 square, activate the queen on that square maybe, knight g to e2, so rather than knight f3, the knight instead goes to g3 where it will challenge f5 and hope to dislodge that bishop. Bishop g7, castles, b3, very useful consolidating move, protecting c4 for the future. As you can see, Karpov was not in a hurry and played this very thoughtful kind of b3 move. And now black played rook a to d8, and I don't really see the purpose in this move either. The rook doesn't seem to belong on d8. Rook f to e8, if we're going to move a rook, looks much more natural to me. I don't see any future for the rook on d8, in fact, at all. Generally speaking, in these kinds of positions, black's plan is to play d5, and then after c5, the knight retreats to c8, and then from c8 it goes usually to e7, and from e7 then to f5 to put pressure on d4. And this can be a quite effective plan for black. It's not always easy to carry out in view of black's lack of space, but it can be effective because he puts pressure on the d4 pawn and generally gets some active pieces, whereas white lacks targets a little bit. Here it might not be so easy though because of some time lost and the fact that black fianchettoed this bishop. It's not going to be that easy. For instance, he may be worried about pressure on the d5 pawn, but rook a to d8 is really not supporting that, so it doesn't look like a very useful move. Now Karpov played queen to c2, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, knight e7. So black prepares to, rather than trying to play d5, he prepares to just play c6 and consolidate his position and defend with slightly less space. White's position is quite pleasant and very small advantage, but no real counterplay for black. So black's idea is now to play knight f5, so Karpov stopped that with knight to g3, c6, rook f to e1, and now d5. Here black did carry out his typical move, but as we can see, his knights are jumping over each other. It's difficult to unwind them. Perhaps black should sit back and with a move like rook f to e8 try to prepare for white's future attempts to make progress. He could even consider a move like knight f5 going into somewhat worse ending. Takes, pawn takes, and here the f-pawns are obviously isolated and doubled, but black does have some counterplay on the queen side, and it's not that easy to attack the pawns. Maybe f4 is immediately an idea. Also, black has things like c5 to attack on the long diagonal, or a5 and d5, such things like this. Of course, black's position is considerably worse, but that was also unpleasant but possible course for black. But Piskunov chose d5, and of course c5, knight b to c8, and rook e2. So white just doubles the rooks on the e-file, the only open file, and clearly there will be a battle fought for this file, where white has every advantage of winning this battle because of his space advantage, which in general makes maneuvers more difficult for black. And in fact, it is the e-file that's proved decisive in the end. Now black played a terrible move, f5. This is just a very weakening, kind of amateurish looking move. Black threatens f4, but it's easily stopped and the pawn won't be able to move backwards, so black has permanent weaknesses on e6 and e5 that he will never be able to cover by a pawn, and this just proves decisive. Black's position wasn't pleasant, but he could have fought on with some other moves. Probably some rook e8, maybe try king f8, knight g8 to rearrange the pieces, or even just, again, going into the ending with knight f5 would be better than playing f5 here. but f5 was played. Bishop f4 stops the f4 threat and activates the bishop, and now king f7. So we can see maybe black was not totally naive in playing f5. He wants to play knight to g8. He wants to use his king to help to fight for the e-file by controlling e8, but none of this is really going to happen because white has the outpost on e5. And the black king is now exposed as well. Rook a to e1, rook f to e8, and now bishop e5. So simple play, just neutralizing the bishop on g7, one of black's only good pieces, and removing any future pressure on d4 that could constrain white's play. Knight to g8. Black's knight needs to move from e7. It has no future there. It wants to go to f6. Knight f1. Karpov's knight also starts to maneuver to better squares. In this case, on g3, it no longer had a purpose, but instead comes around to f3 to use the key e5 square. Black played knight f6, and here was an interesting point. A lot of people would try to stop the invasion of the knight on e4, and bearing in mind Karpov was 11 years old, you would expect the move f3, just stopping that invasion on e4, and clearly white is better here. But what's going to happen with this knight? It no longer can go to f3, and of course you don't want to play f4 because then black will be able to stick the knight forever onto e4 and block the e-file. So instead, Karpov left the f3 square open for now and brought the knight closer to e5 first. And only later he will then be able to drive black's knight out from e4. Black did play knight e4, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, knight f3. So now the knight is coming to e5. Rook e7. Now, before playing knight e5, he wanted to protect c5. For one thing, maybe here, black has knight e5, he has knight takes c5. This doesn't actually work because this is rook is hanging on e7, but in general it will be necessary to play b4 at some point, so there's no hurry to jump in with knight e5. This also does allow maybe an exchange sacrifice, rook takes e5, so in general b4 is necessary, and Karpov played it right away. There's no stopping the knight from getting to e5 anyway. Rook d to e8, now knight e5, queen to d8. The exchange sacrifice would not work here, of course, because rook on e5 would be unguarded. White would play f3 in the end and win further material. Queen to d8, now f3. So now the knight is driven out from e4, exchanged off, and white's advantage is really crystallized here. We look at this position. White has a powerful outpost on e5, which black's knight can't really contest anytime soon. The black knight, meanwhile, is on a very bad circuit. It's going to be difficult to activate this knight. White has more space as well, because of this pawn on c5, as well as, of course, the knight on e5, and the black king is less secure. These things that also, although both sides are fighting for the e-file with doubled rooks, in the end, white ends up winning this fight because of these other factors. Black here played rook e6. He needs to somehow get his knight into the game because on c8 it's just terrible. So he opens e7 to try to transfer the knight around to g8, f6, and then maybe to challenge the white's knight with knight to d7 someday. g3. Another point was just black maybe wanted to play queen h4, so white stopped that. Queen c7. Queen to d2. The white queen comes over toward the king side in order to create some new threats. For instance, queen f4 will start to maybe create a threat of knight takes g6. Also, the queen on g5 could be a problem for black, and white could play h4, h5, which if black really just does nothing, white has a number of ways of making progress. With queen over to the king side, h4, h5, king g2, and then eventually an invasion on the h-file. So black played knight e7, bringing his knight in. And now knight to d3. When black's knight is in the way for a moment, Karpov uses this opportunity to take over the e-file. Now black has to exchange on e2, and white gets control there. But at the same time, well, as I said, there's no way for black really to just sit here and wait forever, because white's easily going to make progress with queen f4, king g2, h4, h5, and so on. among other things. Also could do the same thing on the queen side with a4 and b5 if you wanted to. So knight e7, knight e3, rook e2 is forced, queen takes e2, and now h5. This move is the final straw. This move is just useless and gives black no counterplay, but his position was very difficult here. He could have, his best hope was to play queen d7, stopping white's queen from invading on e6, and hoping to get king f8 and then knight g8 to try to oppose the e-file. This is pretty forlorn hope, but nevertheless it was the only chance. But white can play, for instance, king f2, king f8, knight f4, and now black still can't oppose on the e-file, because if knight g8, then knight e6, and then if king f7, knight g5, king has to keep guarding the rook, and then knight takes h7. And the queen is overworked guarding e8 and h7, so white wins further material, and the game is easily won for white. If black doesn't oppose on the e-file, again, white can just make progress by always knight e6, bringing the queen up, queen e3, h4, h5, and there's no hope for black. Also, queen e5 is coming as well, with threats to invade on h8. So this position is nevertheless hopeless for black. h5 didn't help its case, though. Queen e6. Now knight f4 is coming, as well as after h4, the move that Karpov did play, queen to d6. And black resigned here because he's losing a piece. After the queens are traded, the pawn takes back, and the knight is pinned. And otherwise, obviously black loses. So here we see a very good example of Karpov's very methodical play. Even at such a young age, we see already the kind of style that was typical of his play throughout his career.